everyone is well and remembered to set their clocks up. I remembered to set my clock up. I think I set my alarm for PM instead of AM. So sorry about rushing and not being here on time. Got an announcement here, a reminder, non-widowed meeting at 8:45 in the morning to plan spring luncheon. A thank you note from the Hyders. Easton and the Hyder family wants to say a big thank you to all of our church family that came and supported Easton through the basketball season. It was nice to always have familiar faces cheering him on. Prime timers will meet here at 6 o'clock on March 19th. Please sign up by March 15th. There's a sign-in sheet in the back. This will be a baked potato meal. Baked potatoes will be furnished. Sign up and for what topping you will bring. I'll bring the salt and pepper. Colin left a note, no Monday school for the rest of the month. So we're those who teach in that, remember that tomorrow. Colin's grandfather passed away sometime early this morning, and Colin and family are up at Versailles with his family on that side of the, and we want to remember them, remember his grandfather. He was a Christian, so that's great. He's gone on to his reward, but we mourn for those who are left behind. And when it's a Christian like that, we don't mourn for them because they've gone on to their reward, to a better place. But we do mourn for those of us who didn't get to go at that time. We're in the book of Genesis and talking about Noah in the flood. And we find that Noah pleads God. Was Noah a perfect man? No, he wasn't without sin and all, but he was one who was a just man. And the scriptures say perfect in his generation, that Noah walked with God. And that's something we all want people to be able to say about us, is that we live our Christianity, we walk with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And scriptures tell us that the earth was, this generation was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. When we look at chapter 6, we find some interesting things, especially in verse 4 of this passage. Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. And there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. And those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Does anyone have a different version for verse 6? Do you have? Yeah, this is New King James. Okay. Anyone got verse 4? Uh-huh. Chapter 6, verse 4. Okay.
The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old and men of renown.
Okay, thank you. The Nephilim, you know, who were these, or what were these? Might be a better word to say. Nephilim comes from a Hebrew root word that means the fallen. So these were Nephilims. I don't have the root word with me, but it was like the first 3 or 4 letters of Nephilim. Fallen. Fallen is the root. Fallen, like you fell down or fallen into sin. And when you look at what is being spoken about, the corruption of the earth and sin and all, I think the Nephilim, the best we can say about them is these were men who had followed after the line of Seth and had fallen from grace or fallen into corruption like the rest of the earth except for Noah and his family. And so the best I can come up with for the Nephilim, try to say that fast 3 times with an Oklahoma tongue. Sure. That ain't better? Okay. Not for you? Can you turn it up a little louder, the speaker system? Okay. All right. So this word is mentioned also in Exodus 13 when the children of Israel go in the promised land and spy it out, and the 10 spies come back, and in their description of the land, they say that there were Nephilim in the land, or giants in the land. And we were, in our eyes, like grasshoppers before them. It doesn't say that they were giants, but it indicates that by what the children of Israel, what the 10 spies, thought they were in their eyes. So they were comparing the height, compared to themselves, and these were tall men. And I asked Jonah yesterday if he could carry Jensen on his shoulders, and I thought, that would be a good comparison probably to how tall these guys were. We find later that King David, or David at the time, fights the giant Goliath, and that Goliath was 9 cubits tall, a little over 9 cubits. So, he was very tall. And but it says that the children that came from this union were mighty men, men of old, men of renown. So it doesn't say they were giants, but they may have been. Did that answer that for you, Dan? Okay. There's several popular or unpopular views of who they were, all the way from fallen angels to just human beings who were corrupted and who had fallen. And verse 9 says, "Then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thought of his heart was on evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord says, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." And that's a phrase we all want to be able to insert our name in and say that God finds grace with us, finds those who are following him, those who are following after his righteousness, as Jesus tells us to do. He tells us to seek God's kingdom first and his righteousness. And all of our physical needs will be given to us, not our physical wants, but our physical needs. And, there's normally a big difference between our wants and our needs. But we find that Noah was a man who was, to the best of his ability, was following after God. God speaks to Noah and tells Noah that he is going to bring a great flood upon the earth, and for Noah to build an ark, and he tells Noah how big to build it, and 300 cubits in length. Its width shall be 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits, and which is about 450 feet by 75 by 30, or by 45 feet. This was the same dimensions during World War II that the Liberty ships were built to, and they found out that they were very easy to build, and they floated very well. They were exceptional ships. And two of the biggest shipyards in the United States had a race to see who could build one the fastest. And the best speed record on building one of these ships came from a shipyard in California, who put one together in 7 hours and some odd minutes. And that's from laying the keel down to pushing the ship into the ocean. So indeed, we can see why they continue to build these, use them for freight, cargo, to supply our soldiers and Marines throughout the world. And they could build them faster than the German U-boats could sink them. And it's interesting, the Japanese Navy, their submarines didn't try to sink these ships. They only tried to sink warships. And since these ships didn't have any guns, they didn't mess with them. And yet, we know our submarines sunk a lot of their cargo vessels and transport vessels, and all of that contributed to winning the war. So Noah is given the instructions to build us out of gopher wood, to pitch it within and without, to gather the animals from the earth. Of the clean animals, 7 pairs, and of the unclean animal, 2 pairs of each kind of the animals, the birds that flew in the air, and all the animals that crept upon the earth. So, you know, I wonder which one of the boys was, you know, told to go get the snakes. Yeah. Yeah.
Paul, in Genesis 6 and 22, it says, and Noah did all that God commanded him to do. So that's what God expects of people today, to do all that God commands us to do.
Yeah.
When they say faith only, is
Yeah.
that all? No, it's not all.
And it's interesting, those who believe in faith only, if you really get to talking to them and you go, well, all you got to do is have faith, so you don't need to repent. And most of them will go, well, yeah, you got to repent. And, you know, you trap them that way. You go, well, then you're adding to your faith only. And, you know, instead of following that, to doing all that God commanded. And the last 3 words of that verse is, so he did. So Noah did all that God commanded. Mrs. Noah didn't get oak cabinets in the galley. It was all gopher wood. And does anybody know what kind of wood that was? And where they had to go for, wasn't it? Yeah. They didn't call C. Meeks or any of the other lumber yards and ask them to deliver it. They had to go out with their axes and chop the trees down, delimb them. If they shaped them into squares or whatever, you know, they had to do all this by hand. So it was going to take quite a while for 4 people to do this. And we find that it took quite a long time for Noah to complete the ark, for all the animals to show up and to gather all the food that they were going to be required, you know, for them for about a year's voyage. And we find that in chapter 7, in verse 4, for after 7 more days I will cause it to rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made. And Noah did all according to all that the Lord commanded him. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth. So Noah with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives went into the ark, because the waters of the flood, of the clean animals, and of the unclean animals, of the birds and everything that creepeth on the earth. So they go into the ark 7 days before it starts raining, and it's important to realize that God shut the door. Because, you know, I'm sure, you know, when the floods were just starting, that there were many people who decided Noah wasn't as crazy as we thought he was, so Noah, let me in this boat, or the ark. And, you know, wonder if he built this in the basement of his house. You know, if he did, he had a real big basement. But, you know, we often laugh about things like that. But up till this time, we're not told that it had rained on the earth. You know, God watered the earth in a special way, and but Noah trusted God. He believed God, and he did all that God commanded him to do. And this is the same thing that we should do. we should all trust God and follow God's commands. Now the flood, verse 17, now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heavens were covered. So, even if some of the mountains were not as tall as they are today, even if they were, it wouldn't have been any problem for God to bring water above those. And we can understand it wasn't just a local flood, as some people want to say, and they come up with all kinds of things like, well, this was when the Black Sea was flooded, and it was just localized in that area. But no, it was covering the whole earth. And scientists have found a flood layer, a layer of clean clay, just about all over the earth. Plus, you look at every ancient group of people, and they all have a flood story that in their history. And of course, they have, instead of Noah, they have different people of, their own, that, in the Polynesian people who built a great canoe with all the animals. But I find that really interesting, how we have many who want to say, there is no God and all of this, and yet you can go back and see throughout the earth that there were those who had this story, who remembered it, who wrote it down. And throughout Bible history, if you look at some of the other cultures, if you look at like the Greeks' mythology, compare that to what we read about happening in Israel, and a lot of the Greek stories will kind of go along with the Hebrew history. And we have our super intelligent people who claim to be intelligent will tell us, well, these stories are older than the Bible, so the Jews just borrowed those stories and changed a few things. But God's word is the oldest. It may not have been written first, but it is the most accurate record of what happened to man. And we can, take stock in it. And when it says, God flooded the earth, we can believe it. And we can find the flood layer, we can find the stories that all back up this. And what else can we see that tells us the story's true? Yeah.
Ocean floor gave way and was boiled up. The sediment went all over the world,
Yes.
even to the mountaintops. So there's no way those fossils and those animals could have just crawled up there.
Yeah.
They had to have water to bring them up there, and it covered all of it. So that's one way.
Yeah. What else? Something that we have all seen that is a guarantee to us that this story of Noah and the flood's true.
The rainbow that God promised feet never flooded again?
Yes, the rainbow. God created the rainbow as a sign of his covenant with the earth and with all the animals, that he would never again destroy the earth with rain, with flooding. Now we have local floods, sometimes when it rains a lot, but it's not like this flood where it covered everything. And yet, in western Kansas, we find shark's teeth and different things like that that indicate, yes.
Just a few miles up in the mountains, there's a footprint that was in mud, obviously, of a dinosaur, and it's like halfway up a mountainside, and it's taller, big, almost as big or taller than I am.
Yeah. And speaking of that, in Texas, there's a footprint of a dinosaur with the footprint of a man inside it. So it, shows us that man and dinosaurs lived simultaneously, unlike what our scientists want to claim, that the dinosaurs, died off millions of years ago, because we find too much evidence that man saw dinosaurs. You look at the book of Job, and God asked Job, about a couple of things that the best thing we can describe them as were dinosaurs. One was a land creature, and one was a sea creature. And they were of huge size and everything. And again, we can look back in the remains of ancient civilizations and find pictures in caves and things that of dinosaurs and things. Kevin?
I read somewhere here recently that they were trying to say that his apostles only went to Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. But then again, you also hear scientists tell us that at that time, the United States, South America, that was all one big chunk, and it broke free somewhere in whatever. I don't know. Because if it was like it is today, would they have taken boats that far, or could they have taken boats that far to come over here?
Yeah, we have evidence from China and Japan both traveled to, California, Oregon. So there was, travel in that area. When Paul tells us that the gospel went throughout the world, we can believe it. It went to everyone. Everyone heard it. They may not have all believed it, but they all at least had the opportunity to hear the gospel. What did Noah do when the ark settled on Mount Ararat? How did he know that the waters had receded enough that he could come out of the ark? Okay, he sent a dove. Kevin?
It came back, but then he sent the dove, and it came back with a branch.
Yeah. First time he sent it out, it came back with nothing. And so Noah waited 7 more days, sent it out again, and it comes back with an olive branch. So, Noah knew that the waters had receded enough that the trees were leafed out, and that, he could go ahead and let all the creatures out. So they do that, and God tells him, the rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh is on the earth. And God says to Noah, this is a sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. And, when we see the rainbow, think of God. Think of Noah and the flood and how, here it is so many years later, and God is keeping that reminder of his covenant for him and also for us. Kevin?
In Genesis 8:7, it says then he sent out a raven,
Yes.
which kept going to and fro until the waters had dried up from the earth. He also sent out and then he sent out the dove
Yeah.
after that.
Yeah, the raven was a stronger flyer, and so it just continued to fly until it could find some place. Sorry about this. Okay, so we find in chapter 10 that, or in chapter 9, they come out of the ark, and Noah began to be a farmer and planted a vineyard. Then he drank of the wine and was drunk and became uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Cain, saw the nakedness of his father, and he told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and went backward into the tent and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. So Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done to him. Then he said, "Cursed be Cain, a servant of servants, he shall be to his brethren." And he said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Cain be his servants. May God enlarge Jephthah, and may he dwell in tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." And Noah lived after the flood 350 years. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Anybody getting close to that age? No, not quite. Yeah. Yeah, some days Clayton feels like, he's pushing 900. But he's really not. But we find that before the flood, in Genesis chapter 5, that 500-600 years was fairly common for most people. So, when we get to feeling old at 70 and 80, we need to remember in God's eyes, we're just teenagers. Kevin?
They were vegetarians back then, and then when they started eating meat, they started dying earlier.
Well, that's a possibility, but we know that probably the flood removed some protective layer from the earth. But we know that before the flood, God said the days of man, or the years of man, was going to be 120. And, he lowers that down again in the scriptures. But, these men of old, there's no one like them today. And it may have been the closeness to God. Kevin?
Talking about the giants earlier, I guess a cubit now is considered 1.5 feet. But the Egyptians had one that was 1.72 inches. So it's anywhere from 13.5 to 15.5 feet tall.
Yeah. But still, that's tall. Jared and Jonah are 6'7" or so, something like that.
As far as the age is concerned, I would say they have better genetics back then. Our genetics degrading over time, and go on, and as we go on and continue to to reproduce, we have more and more genetic defaults that occur, and so technically speaking, our genetic pool is getting worse. So they had superior genetics to help them live longer.
Yeah. Wasn't our genetics now is not what they used to be. DNA has corrupted. In chapter 10, we find the genealogy of the sons of Noah. And how was Canaan marked as a servant of all? Does anyone, it doesn't say he was marked in any way.
Burnt skin, and of course we know that he settled in the region that we now call Africa. So that we know that emanates, all the black folks that we know emanate from that part of the world. They came over this continent out of the shores of Africa.
Yeah.
So we can assume that that was the mark of Cain, or not Cain necessarily, but it could have been mark of Cain, but it's Ham here and his descendants were down in that part of the world.
Well, remember, Ham was not cursed; his son was.
Well, yes, and but we know that here in Psalms, let's say 78 and 51 says, "And they smote all the firstborn of Egypt, and the chief of their strength in the tabernacles of Ham."
Yeah.
So Egypt, of course, is up at the upper coast of
Yes.
Africa.
So, we can read through this and see kind of where these three settled after the Tower of Babel was being constructed, and God comes down and confuses the language. And, remember what God had commanded man before the flood: be fruitful and multiply and cover the whole earth. And so the Tower of Babel, one of the main reasons for building that is they didn't want to scatter out. They wanted to stay together and, become a great people. And so in chapter 11 and verse 3, then they said one to another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." For they had bricks for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." So it didn't take people long to, once again, start disobeying God. But God comes down, but the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they are all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, that they might not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. So we find that God confused their languages, and you can just kind of understand that each group, they woke up one morning and they had all been able to understand each other that night, and then they woke up and they couldn't understand their neighbor. They couldn't understand anyone else except maybe a small group way over here. So we can see how each language group kind of gathered together and moved, for their own little space in the world. And So it's interesting how, God takes care of what he wants done. In chapter 11, in verse 26, now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nabor, and Haran. And then it gives us his descendants and tells us about them. Okay, many people, scientists and different ones, especially Jewish scholars, say that Genesis chapters 1 through 11 is myth. Chapter 12 on, it's facts. And because it starts talking about Abraham or Abram, the father of the faithful. But we can believe chapters 1 through 11. Jesus mentions stuff out of most all of these chapters. And Jesus, if it was myth, I don't think he would have mentioned it or used it. But, he treated it as fact. And I believe so can we. Mankind, doesn't want to believe the Bible because if they believe it, they've got to accept that there's going to be a judgment. And a lot of people do not want to face the judgment, face the facts. Thank you for your attention, and next week we'll get into chapter 12.